Committee will come to order. We welcome everyone to today's forum on victims of violent crime in Chicago. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois to lead us all in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Again, we want to thank you all for being here today. The chair is now recognized for an opening statement. Today's forum is about our commitment to justice and keeping communities safe. In recent years, we've all seen how the radical left has sought to undermine public safety in the name of criminal justice reform. The left has implemented pro-criminal policies that have allowed dangerous criminals to remain on the street. The left has attacked law enforcement and sought to defund the police. And then when crime goes up, they act shocked, and when cities become less safe, they act surprised. Earlier this year, we traveled to New York City and heard directly from victims of violent crime. We heard about the consequences of soft-on-crime policies implemented by rogue prosecutors and radical policymakers in New York City. Today, we are in the great city of Chicago, the second in our series on violent crime in major urban areas, to hear directly from victims. Thank you to our witnesses for your willingness to be here, and thank you for sharing your stories. Innocent people in Chicago are victimized by a justice system that cares more about political correctness than punishing the criminals who've harmed them and their families. For 11 years, Chicago has led the country in homicides, and has only gotten worse under State's Attorney Kim Foxx. According to an official report by the Chicago Police Department, crime in Chicago overall has increased during the last 5 years by nearly 20%. Theft is also a huge problem in Chicago, which saw an 114% increase in car thefts and a 32% increase in other thefts between 2018 and 2022. We know Chicago experienced yet another summer with higher rates of violence. Memorial Day weekend started with 11 people killed and 53 others, including 2 toddlers, wounded in shootings across the city. Over Labor Day weekend, 10 were killed and 34 more were wounded, including a 6-year-old boy struck by a bullet in his thigh while he was at his home. And we know what happened this past weekend. 30 individuals shot this past weekend. The rise in violent crime in Chicago has been coupled with attacks on the men and women who wear the uniform, on our great law enforcement officers. 2021, 76 Chicago police officers were shot in the line of duty. 2 officers, tragically, have already been killed this year. The brave men and women in law enforcement deserve better. Chicago leaders have argued Ms. Fox's policies on non-prosecution and eliminating cash bail are keeping too many criminals on the streets and making the city more dangerous. Her presumption is not to prosecute. Remember the violent riots back in 2020 where there were charges of assault, mob action, and aggravated battery to a police officer? Ms. Foxx told her office that there should be a presumption against proceeding unless there was a body or a dash cam footage available, or if a police officer was the complainant. A rogue prosecutor's decision not to prosecute crimes is made even worse when the legislature passes its pro-criminal policies that they did just recently with the so-called Safety Act. This law abolished bail, implemented arrest and release policies for policing, limited when defendants could be deemed flight risk, and prevented police from arresting nonviolent trespassers. The result? 63% of Chicagoans now do not feel safe in their city. By downplaying surging crime and denying victims justice, the leaders of this city are failing their citizens. I mean, you stop and think about it. First it was defund the police, the former mayor. Then it's this Safety Act, and then it's a prosecutor who won't prosecute the bad guys. All that leads to the situation we see today. A former Cook County prosecutor, a 25-year veteran of the office, resigned last summer, saying he had zero confidence in the prosecutor's office. This level of crime spills into every aspect of daily life in Chicago. Local pharmacy chose to open 2 aisles for shoppers while everything else is kept hidden and only bringing out items at the shopper's request. The pharmacy took such drastic steps because retail theft and the violence that comes with it is just too great in Chicago. We want to also extend a special thank you to the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police John Canizara, thank you for the work you do, the FOP president. I saw John just right here on the front. Yeah, right there on the front. Thank you so much. You guys, you've been tremendous hosts. We appreciate all you've done to help us set this up today. And we support you, and we thank you for serving our country every day. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation. And before we get to our witnesses, I want to ask the chairman of the Subcommittee on Crime, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I thank our witnesses for being here to testify today, and our members. Thank you to the FOP for opening up your doors and providing this wonderful facility for us. I want to also let everyone know that this is an official committee hearing. Committee hearing as if we were in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives. It is official. Every member of this committee knew about it and was invited to be here and has a duty, quite frankly, to be here. But you'll notice that, unfortunately, some of my colleagues across the aisle decided they didn't want to come and hear these important witnesses and what they have to testify and consider this very critical and important issue. And I'm saddened for that. I'm saddened for that. But I will tell you that the Crime Subcommittee has worked hard on these issues. And let me just give you an idea. We've had hearings on retail crime because that's exploding in cities. Speaking of exploding, the explosion of fentanyl across our country. It affects everyone, small cities, large cities. In San Francisco, for instance, every day 3 people die from fentanyl overdose. We've talked about border crime. We actually had a field hearing in Cochise County, Arizona, because of what's happening across our border. And it explodes and also impacts everything, including here in Chicago. You're impacted by the illegal migration that's taking place. Again, at that field hearing, an official hearing, not one Democrat showed up. What a shame. Last week we had a hearing for victims of sex trafficking, which is America is the biggest sex trafficking, and our federal government is the biggest logistic arm for the cartels who are bringing in sex trafficking, facilitating sex trafficking. What a shame. We will have a series of hearings to mark up a number of bills and legislation dealing with all of these issues, commencing Thursday and going regularly for the remainder of this year. I thank the chairman, Mr. Jordan, for his leadership on this issue and for bringing us here to Chicago, this great city. On Sunday, Breitbart News reported at least 30 shootings in Chicago over the weekend with 3 fatalities. One victim, an 86-year-old man, was shot around 10 a.m. on Saturday while retrieving something from his truck. The second fatality occurred at 12:40 a.m. Sunday, about 2 miles from here, where we're sitting, where a 40-year-old was shot in the chest. And the third fatality occurred at 10:45 a.m. The 24-year-old victim was sitting in his vehicle when another vehicle pulled up alongside. 2 men exited and opened fire, killing the man. The Chicago Sun-Times has reported at least 433 people killed in Chicago from January 1 through September 24. Crime is also pushing businesses out of Chicago. Walmart has permanently closed 1/2 of their locations in Chicago in recent months. AT&T, Gap, Banana Republic, Uniqlo, Macy's, and Verizon have all closed locations in Chicago. Yesterday, a member of my staff went to grab a few items from Walgreens located across the street from the Art Institute of Chicago, around the corner from the iconic Cloud Gate sculpture in Grant Park. A sign indicated the store will be closing permanently within the month. And aisle by aisle, every product, including deodorant, toothpaste, were behind locked cases to prevent the retail crime. These soft-on-crime policies undermine the rule of law and limit the freedom of everyday people. Law-abiding everyday people live in fear, and that fear results in limits on the ability to travel, engage in commerce, and to associate one with another. These policies emasculate law enforcement. They hand over control of a once great American city to violent criminals. And when I speak about this, I'm thinking of what really makes a community, its ability to trust each other. And that seems to be gone in so many cities. Tragedy. It's a tragedy.
And we look at our citizens and we say, how could this be? How can it be? It is because of failure of leadership. And I predict to you that we as a nation, if we continue on this path of lawlessness and a disregard for the rule of law, we will lose our freedoms. In order to have freedom, you must adhere to the rule of law. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and he was spot on. We now will introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Gianno Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell is a political analyst and founder of Caldwell Strategic Consulting, which provides strategic advice and consulting services related to public affairs. On June 24th, 2022, 15 months ago, his younger brother Christian was murdered in Chicago. Police determined that he was not the target of the shooting, but was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we have seen you, Mr. Caldwell, out there as an outspoken advocate for stopping this surge of violent crime we see across the country. We appreciate that work, and we appreciate you being here today. Mr. John Garrido III. Mr. Garrido served with the Chicago Police Department for more than 30 years, retiring as lieutenant in 2022. During his career, he worked in the patrol division, narcotics, violent crime, and homicide. We appreciate you being here today and the 30 years of service you gave this town and you gave to law enforcement. And finally, Mr. Carlos Yanez Jr. Mr. Yanez was shot several times in the head and shoulder during a traffic stop in August 2021 while serving as a Chicago police officer. Mr. Yanez's partner was tragically killed during this incident. After being shot, Yanez's doctors told him that he would never move the left side of his body again, but he regained movement after extensive physical therapy. We appreciate your service. We appreciate your perseverance and your dedication to overcoming the tragic shooting that you had to endure. We welcome all of our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. Please know that we have any written statements that you shared with us ahead of this forum. So accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes if you can, but we're going to be lenient with that. If you got to go 7-8 minutes, you go right ahead. This is that important. And we're going to start with Mr. Caldwell and then work right down the line. So Mr. Caldwell, you're recognized for whatever amount of time you want to take.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Jordan. Thank you, Chairman Biggs. And a special thank you to Congressman Burgess Owens, who's been working behind the scenes with me since last year to ensure that I can be before this body. My name is Gianno Caldwell. I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. I got involved in public service when I was 14 years old, working for my local alderman, because I actually believed my community in Chatham could be saved from violence, crime, and drugs. I eventually moved with the same goals in mind to Washington, D.C. and became a political consultant and a national media analyst and TV personality. Before I begin, I truly wish that it was not my place to be before you today. But I believe I have no choice. No choice because of the countless people in my hometown, including my own family, who are innocent victims of murder and violent crime. Those who are shot, robbed, carjacked, or even worse, those who've had multiple people in their family murdered in Chicago. Those voices scream out for justice. Many of the elected officials here in Chicago have ignored those voices, and it has come at a great price for the people of the city, not just in blood, but also in treasure and opportunity as multi-billion-dollar businesses like King Griffin Citadel justifiably fled Chicago, and he took millions of dollars in tax revenue with him. We know this has happened in due part to the policies of the Cook County prosecutor, Chicago's most recent mayors, the governor, other politicians throughout the state of Illinois. These officials have recklessly ignored the people they were elected to represent. And as a result, bodies, mostly black bodies, are littered throughout the streets of Chicago. I unfortunately understand the pain of thousands of victims whose families have been destroyed. On June 24th of last year, I received a call that my innocent teenage baby brother Christian had been murdered, shot down in the street by a stranger when a group of men stepped out of a black SUV and fired into a crowd on 114 South Vincent Street. The police have repeatedly said that my brother was not the target, that he just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. But in Chicago, being at the wrong place at the wrong time could be sleeping in your bed and a bullet comes through your window. Or in the backseat of a car at a McDonald's drive-thru as 7-year-old Jocelyn Adams was murdered. Living in Chicago should not come with a death sentence, but it does for too many Chicagoans. My brother Christian had the potential to do well in life. I still remember the day when he begged me to take him on a college tour out of state when he was just 16 years old. And we went. But Christian will never have the opportunity to go to college or to get married or to have kids or to build a career. And so many other youth in Chicago have experienced the same reality. I refuse to capitulate to the idea that Christian had just become another Chicago statistic, one of the hundreds of homicides in Chicago in 2022. There's an abundance of potential in Chicago among our youth and old alike. Unfortunately, much of that potential lies in graveyards across our city. Chicago recently had the highest number of homicides in more than a quarter of a century. As of today, 2023, it is on pace to join the previous 2 years as one of the most violent years in our city's history. From the moment I learned my brother Christian was murdered, I felt defeated. Since my younger sister Mia called me on June 24th screaming into the phone, "Christian is gone," I felt a giant void in my heart. Never had I made room for the thought or possibility that someone so close to my life would be so stolen so violently. But that's naive, I suppose. On the same day my brother was killed, a 5-month-old girl by the name of Cicely was murdered in a drive-by shooting while sitting in the backseat of a car with her family. Chicago is an active war zone. This is not hyperbole. It's the people who are afraid to leave their homes, to walk to and from work, to walk anywhere in this city. Would this same fear, would these same murders be accepted in the suburbs? Absolutely not. The soft on crime policies that many of you know about here are prosecutors like Kim Foxx, who refuses to prosecute, decriminalization of offenses, laws like the Safety Act, which ends cash bail and allow criminals back on the street to commit more crime, and the no chase policy, which constrains the police from doing their jobs. Policies pushed by the Cook County prosecutor and current and previous mayors have proved to be a death sentence for the people of the city of Chicago. What started off as perhaps a noble cause for criminal justice reform has become justice for the criminal. It is our police who have been handcuffed, as criminals no longer live in fear of arrest or prosecution. When you can steal at will, when you can drive away from a police stop, the streets become lawless. Murder, as many like my family know too well, is close behind. The elected officials here have systematically endangered the lives of all Chicagoans, but especially those of color, the marginalized who they claim to care about the most. Most shot and murdered in Chicago are black men. According to the Chicago police, African Americans, including my brother, made up of 80% of the murder victims in Chicago in 2022. For the record, black people make up only 29% of the city's population. We need help. Congress must use the power of the purse to place restrictions on the funding received by local governments to ensure elected officials are focused on what should be their #1 priority, the protection of its citizens. Federal dollars are used effectively for natural disasters from storms to pandemics. It's time to use those same resources for man-made disasters. Providing funding for local law enforcement agencies to help hire, train more officers with the latest crime-fighting techniques, support programs that address the root cause of crime, job training, education, and other social services to help people in at-risk communities. As small as it sounds, the federal government can help provide some special funding for funerals, as innocent people being killed are those who need such help the most. Let the world know how many are buried in our communities here. Pass legislation that supports community policing, which emphasizes building much-needed relationships between law enforcement officers and the communities they serve. The First Step Act, a law that I lobby for personally, provides funding for programs that help people who have been incarcerated successfully reintegrate into society. Congress could increase funding for the Second Chance Act to help reduce recidivism rates. Finally, Congress and the federal government should employ the full use of the FBI to help clear out murder cases in our cities. When I first spoke to the detective handling my brother's case, he told me he had other priorities and more cases had come in since my brother was murdered. I've since been told Chicago alone needs 2,000 new detectives to handle the current caseload. It wasn't until I angrily went on Chicago and national media that the detective took me seriously. I had access to a platform most families do not. Even then, it didn't last long. Soon, police weren't returning my calls. And they weren't, even though there's been someone arrested, my brother's murder has not yet been solved. Ultimately, I believe the Chicago Police Department had failed my family and countless others. Reforms within the Chicago Police Department are needed. I've had to go through hell in an attempt to get justice for my brother. I'm now working directly with the FBI Chicago field office. How many of the hundreds of murderers have that same opportunity? My love for Chicago is infinite and unconditional. It will always be home to me. I first got involved in public service when I was just 14, volunteering for my local alderman every day after school like it was a job. A decision which set me on a path to public service to help a city I love so much. But my family and no family should go through what I've experienced this past year. We have more resources than any nation in history. Why aren't we using those resources for people who need them most? Why are we allowing our cities, from Chicago to New York, to Los Angeles, to Baltimore, to Oakland, to Philadelphia, to San Francisco, to remain dangerous kill zones? While migrants are traveling from across the world to Chicago for a sanctuary city status, there continues to be no sanctuary and no peace for the very people who call Chicago home their entire lives. Today I'm here to demand justice and accountability, not just for my baby brother, but the thousands of other Chicagoans whom we may never know their names. I implore you to exercise your full power and resources. Christian's death is senseless. It's a senseless loss, but it doesn't have to be a meaningless one. Please make him one of our last victims and help us save the people of Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. That was we appreciate that and appreciate what the tragedy your family's had to deal with and what you've had to go through. So thank you for being here. Officer Yanez, you're now recognized, and you can take as much time as you want as well.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and esteemed members of the House Committee on the Judiciary. I am a disabled Chicago police officer, Carlos Yanez Jr., star number 16022. Thank you for this opportunity to be heard and address this very important forum that hopefully brings light to the failings of some of our leadership and our elected officials that have created so many victims of violent crimes in Chicago. We all have seen the tragedies resulting from violent crime wave that has swept through Chicago, and the victims who have to live with the pain of it every day, including myself. I am blessed to be speaking before you all today after what happened to my partners and I on the night of August 7th, 2021. While conducting a traffic stop, a repeat offender fired upon us with a firearm acquired by a straw purchaser without remorse or hesitation. A straw purchaser is somebody who purchases a firearm for someone who else is prohibited by law from possessing one, killing one of Chicago's finest police officers, my partner, my friend, Ella Grace French. I was shot a total of 5 times, 4 of which were in the head. I lost my right eye, some of my hearing in both ears. I also have tinnitus in my right ear, as well as partially paralyzed on the left side of my body. I almost didn't survive my injuries. It was my dream to become a Chicago police officer for as long as I can remember. Then in August of 2014, my calling became a reality. I started the Chicago Police Academy. I was then assigned to 7th District, also known as Inglewood, where I spent most of my career. I had the honor of learning and working among some of the greatest officers and supervisors who became family. To see their commitment to serve their community and to respond to dangerous situations without hesitation every day gave me even more pride to wear the badge. Under Mayor Lightfoot's administration, the department disbanded gang, gun, and saturation teams and combined them into what is now known as Community Safety Team, created to protect residents from escalating violence due to the riots of 2020. But with all the policies and procedures put into place, officers find themselves with their hands tied behind their back. Being an officer is stressful enough, but now it seems like there is a witch hunt after officers unnecessarily. Even after Ella Grace's French is passing, COPA disciplined her for a search warrant on the only thing that she was seen doing on her body camera was assisting a woman. This made me sick to my stomach. COPA continues to serve suspension days to officers like candy on Halloween. Cook County has its own issues under Kim Fox's administration. I've never heard of so many state's attorneys resigning or transferring to other counties, refusing to no longer work under her. Cook County has become a revolving door. Officers continue to lock up violent offenders, but we find them back. Then we find them back on the streets committing even more violent crimes, including murder. I just hope we elect someone that is going to demand accountability this next term. I understand this position is not easy, but we have criminals fleeing suburban police departments and questioning if they are in Cook County because they know there will be less repercussions for their actions in Cook County versus surrounding counties. Let me give you an example. Several offenders in possession of a stolen vehicle and firearms committing numerous armed robberies throughout the city, and someone is shot or worse, killed. The only person who pulled the trigger is charged with first-degree murder, and others will not, even though in the act of committing a forcible felony, someone was killed. It used to be all parties involved would be charged with the highest charge possible. As for making stricter gun laws, we in Illinois already have one of the strictest gun laws that only law-abiding citizens follow. The more laws you put into place is only going to up the price of firearms on the street that straw purchasers are selling. I say we enforce the laws that we have on individuals that are illegally in possession of a firearm and make it a minimum of 3 years in jail automatically. Straw purchasers should be charged as the same as offenders who pull the trigger. It is time to stop coddling criminals and holding them accountable for their actions. Only then will they stop and think before they carjack, rob, shoot, or kill a law-abiding citizen. Certainly, we have many other issues contributing to many victims of violent crimes in Chicago. I pray this committee and everyone listening hears this testimony I have given to you today and takes the proper actions needed to address these issues. Thank you, members of the House Committee on Judiciary, for allowing me to present my testimony and give you the perspective as a Chicago police officer and as a victim of violent crime. God bless all the officers doing their job around the country, and be safe. God bless you all.
Officer, thank you. We appreciate your inspiring story as well. Lieutenant Garrido, you are recognized for 5 minutes or a few more if you'd like. Go right ahead.
I want to thank you all for giving us the opportunity to shine a light on what's happening here in the city of Chicago. I'm here today to discuss the adverse effects of politics on law enforcement in Chicago. While law enforcement and politics should operate in distinct spheres, their intersection severely undermines the efficiency and the credibility of our police force. When politicians prioritize ideological goals over evidence-based practices, it puts our officers in a difficult position. They become pawns in a larger political game, forced to enforce laws and policies that may not necessarily serve the best interests of our community and public safety. Political agendas also heavily impact how resources are allocated in our department. The defund the police movement has had dire consequences. The result, a police department that is both underfunded and understaffed, compromising our ability to serve and protect. We often hear that the silent majority supports the police. Yet, unfortunately, our silent majority here in Chicago is asleep at the wheel. Despite having over 1.5 million registered voters here in Chicago, nearly 1 million stayed home during the last mayoral election. And those numbers happen again and again, over and over every election. The result is allowing a radical minority electing politicians with agendas that don't serve the broader community's interests. We have a mayor that actually scolds reporters for demonizing children when asking questions about the mobs of teens that regularly rampage throughout our downtown business district, destroying property and stealing anything they can get their hands on. Lack of voter interest has given us legislators that changed the threshold for felony theft from $300 to $500, and then they gave us Kim Fox, who increased it from $500 to $1,000. So as long as you steal something that's under $1,000, you're not going to get charged with a felony in Cook County. Illinois state legislators also passed the 800-page Safety Act in the early hours of the morning with little to no discussion whatsoever. They passed this act and it gave us no cash bail that just went into effect last week. On the first day of no cash bail last week, individuals charged with violent crimes were released without any restrictions. 2 people were charged with robbery, and a guy was accused of punching a Chicago police officer in the face, and they went home without restrictions, and there was no request by the prosecutor for a detention hearing. Another offender was sent home without any restrictions after being accused of attacking 4 police officers and sending 2 to the hospital. Yet again, the prosecutor's office did not ask for any detention hearing. Chicago politicians also often make sweeping generalizations that don't reflect the complexities of law enforcement. These same politicians publicly refer to our police department as systemically racist. This not only undermines the public trust, but also affects officers' morale and effectiveness. Constant political interference has had a detrimental impact. In just the first 100 days since Mayor Johnson was sworn into office on May 15, 2023, we've had over 200 homicides, 900 people have been shot, 2,500 robberies, 5,000 stolen cars, 2,000 burglaries, and 300 carjackings. Since January of 2020, almost 15,000 people have been shot in the city of Chicago, and almost 3,000 have been murdered. The problem is, it's become so normalized here that those numbers aren't even shocking to us anymore, and they're not even shocking to the general public. Department policies, lack of manpower, and Illinois laws have impacted our ability to make arrests as well, dropping over 83% from 225,000 arrests in 2006 to the last few years we've been averaging about 38,000 arrests a year, a significant drop. Catalytic converter thieves are now armed and they're shooting at homeowners and residents that confront them. Carjackers are getting younger and younger. Most of them are under the age of 18 years old. As a matter of fact, they just arrested 4 of them a few days ago. One was as young as 12 years old. Officers are retiring and resigning at alarming rates. We're currently over 2,000 officers short on the Chicago Police Department. And of the 1,100 officers that left last year, 350 of them were resignations, which used to be unheard of here. And those resignations, the majority of them are lateral transfers. So they're not leaving law enforcement, they're leaving Chicago law enforcement. Officers are second-guessing themselves. With a job that requires you to make split-second decisions, second-guessing yourself can bring devastating mistake. One example was an officer who was fighting with an offender on PCP. He was able to overcome her and repeatedly bang her head against the concrete while her partners and other officers tried to tase him and try to subdue him. They subsequently got him in custody, but not before she sustained massive head injuries and permanent brain damage. The one thing that she said afterward was she thought she was going to die and she knew that she should shoot him, but she didn't do it. She chose not to because she didn't want her family and the department to go through the scrutiny that would be made public the next day in the news. And it's not just laws that make our communities unsafe. These elected officials have discarded experience and used race and gender to select the leaders of our department. The last superintendent, David Brown, was probably the worst of all. He brought us scarecrow policing, excessive canceled days off that exhausted our officers, politically motivated punishments and penalties for minor infractions, and promotion after promotion of inexperienced officers based solely on their gender and the color of their skin. We have people now in this department that have actually gone from the rank of sergeant to deputy chief in 10 months, or they've gone from sergeant to commander in less than 2 months. And they haven't been given the opportunity to learn their roles in those positions before they move on to the next rank, which not only impacts morale in the department, but also impacts the quality of leadership. And probably the worst statistic of all is our police suicide rate. The national average for law enforcement is 30% above the national average. Here in Chicago, it's 60% above the national average. We usually average about 2 to 3 officers a year that take their lives. Last year, 7 took their lives. Chicago and Illinois politicians have come together to create a toxic work environment like we've never experienced before. These policies and legislation have made our communities less safe and made it even more dangerous to be a Chicago police officer. We can't afford to let the silent majority sit quietly anymore, and I hope with hearings like this and repeatedly speaking about it that hopefully we can get the word out that elections have consequences, and they need to start paying attention to who they're voting for and who they're putting in office, because the consequences so far have been devastating. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant. When you let bad guys stay on the street, you shouldn't be surprised when you get more crime. When you defund the police, you shouldn't be surprised when you get more crime. When you pass legislation that ends cash bail, you shouldn't be surprised when you get more crime. And when you do all those things, you shouldn't be surprised that we have, what, a 1,700 police officer shortage in the city. That's what left-wing policies have done. And we got a short video we want to show that shows how it plays out on the street, which you've all talked about and all experienced in a personal and firsthand way. So if we could play that video, and then we'll get right to the members' questions.
Chicago's now the carjacking capital of the nation.
Bodies are being littered in the streets of Chicago.
Violent crime continues to plague Chicago. It's not only hurting the people who live there, but also the businesses that call Chicago home.
Deadly gun violence is surging in Chicago once again.
Another night of crime alerts. These attacks are just crazy.
Viciously stabbed in a random attack.
Thefts have exploded.
It's like it's the Wild West. I mean, it's very scary.
No one can ever be safe in the city of Chicago.
10 armed robberies within a 30-minute period.
It's not a matter of, if you're going to be hit, but when you're going to be hit.
Unending, senseless, insane violence across the Windy City.
The vehicle break-ins in this area have become a near daily occurrence.
We've seen an explosion, shootings, and murders. The Democrat-led city is seeing a 40% spike with no signs of slowing down.
Park your car, you don't know if it's going to be the night it's going to get broken into again.
Motor vehicle thefts are up in the city 104%.
Crimes are mounting.
19,000 car thefts. Vehicles left covered in shattered glass.
5-month-old baby was among those killed. We have yet to hear our mayor say anything, word one, about the criminals running rampant in our street.
We'll now recognize the gentleman from Arizona. Just so you know, if any of you need a break, just let us know. We'll take a break, but we're going to proceed 5-minute questions from each of our members. But like I said, if you need a break, just let us know. We'll be happy to take a break. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's start with you, Officer Yanez. One of the things you said is you called upon enforcement of the laws, and that presupposes that your district attorneys and your prosecution is not enforcing the laws. Can you expand on that for a moment?
Sure, I can. Yes, I can, Chairman. We have criminals, like I said, it's a revolving door. We have individuals that are committing countless acts of crime, violent crimes, and they're just being released, and they're just getting multiple probation sentences. As an officer on the job, we were arresting numerous offenders that were charged with, convicted of murder and released within a 6-7 year period, which was ridiculous. And it's just terrible.
And they reoffend.
And they were arrested for firearms, possession of firearms. So we have a convicted murderer in possession of a firearm.
Thank you. Lieutenant Garrido, the numbers that you were citing are just staggering, and you talked upon it, but I want you to talk about specifically the second guessing that officers undergo because of the hostility, if you will, towards officers who are making decisions in a split second that affect life and death.
It's happening because the way officers are treated, the way that they're treated after an incident occurs. You've got situations where, like I said, officers have to make split-second decisions, and they're immediately scrutinized, they're attacked, they're put on desk duty for supposed to be 90 days. We've had some officers that have been put on desk duty for as much as 2 years. And other officers come in every day to work, and they see that officer sitting there, and they realize, okay, that could be me next. We see other officers that are actually they're threatened with criminal charges, or we see them actually get where they try to fire them.
So that impacts the morale, but
time.
that also impacts the safety of the citizens because of the morale.
Well, because it's going to make officers hesitate, right? You're going to have officers that are going to, they don't want to get fired, they don't want to go to jail for maybe possibly an innocent mistake, and when you're having to weigh all that stuff out in a split-second decision, it's tough to do.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. You're a native of Chicagoan. How do you think these policies have affected the changes you've seen in the safety in the community you grew up in?
Well, I think we just saw it all on tape, and I've heard my voice in that tape multiple times. I got to tell you, when you handcuff the police, what do you expect? Lawlessness. That's what tends to happen, and we've seen our Chicago police handcuff. We've seen them demoralized by previous mayors, and we continue to see that, I believe, under Brandon Johnson. They have a policy called this no chase policy, where officers aren't allowed to chase a suspect in their car without calling into their supervisor, or you can't chase them on foot. Criminals know this, so what do you think they're going to do? They're going to take advantage of every opportunity to commit more crime, and the politicians here seemingly don't get it, and it's become problematic for everyone. But as I mentioned before, every community in Chicago has been impacted by this, but especially for a lot of the politicians that run the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, the folks that they seemingly care a lot about are the black and brown folks who are taking the brunt of the pain, the murders. Things need to change here quickly.
And each of you can comment on this. It's something that all of you have alluded to, and it's the ideological preference over actually providing real safety to the community. And I'll start with you, Mr. Caldwell, and then work on down, please.
Would you repeat your question, please?
Yes. I want you to expand on this notion of how the ideological or political priorities of those who are in political leadership actually undermine ultimately the safety. In other words, they've placed their political ideology over the safety of the community to which they are charged to ensure.
And we've seen the seed of that through the no bail laws. So the cash bail we saw in the First Step Act, not First Step Act, I'm sorry, with the Safety Act, with that initial original bill, second-degree murder, non-detainable offense, arson, non-detainable offense. Many offenses you would think, we want to put these folks away for a very long time, non-detainable offense. And it's been a seed that has started across the country, and one, I think, because we haven't really seen much yet, because the implementation of that law just started. But I'm believing, just based on just pure logic and common sense, that this is going to make matters much worse. So where we are in Chicago right now, where you can be downtown Chicago, be robbed, killed, whatever the case may be, we're really entering Gotham City based on the law that just got implemented.
I seen it firsthand under Mayor Lightfoot's administration when she disbanded all the gang and saturation and gun teams. It made a huge impact. You had veteran officers that knew what they were doing, experienced in what they did, and specialized in what they did. They knew the streets. They knew the offenders, because it's always the same offender. You know, the community that I worked in, it's beautiful. Inglewood's beautiful. Most of the criminals don't live in Inglewood. They just travel there. And they're repeat offenders. And it's terrible to see a beautiful community that's affected when she started this community safety team. You had experienced officers that they felt unappreciated. And as we said, the morale just went out the door. So you had experienced officers that just decided to go back because there was too much liability on the officers doing their job. And when you're chasing offenders with guns, you know, things happen bad. And like others have said, you know, you don't want to be put in that position. You don't want your family to be put in that position where you're going to be on callback or worse, charged criminally, or you're going to lose your job. You know, it's just terrible. And then COPA's, it's terrible what COPA's doing to these officers, proactive officers too, most of them. They're trying to do their job because they love what they do. And like I said, it's not a job, it's a career, a calling. And we see something and you want to react. And it happens in a split second. What happened to us was seconds. And it could have happened differently if there wasn't certain policies and procedures that were put in place.
Thank you so much. My time has long expired. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrido. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Benz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all of you for being here. Mr. Caldwell, I lost a younger brother in an airplane crash. I couldn't talk about it for 3 years. It's been 5 years ago. I have to compliment you on being here, because there becomes a callousness, kind of a feeling that these deaths don't really matter. So without people like you stepping up and explaining the loss, then things don't tend to happen. So I want to thank you again for what it takes for you to be here today.
Thank you.
And perhaps you can share with us what you do to try to bring yourself to talk about this kind of loss.
Well, honestly, when this happened on June 24th, I didn't make it public until the next day. But I was really going to wait until the following week because I didn't want to have to deal with the emotions that come with the folks calling and checking in on you. But I decided to post it on June 25th and make it publicly known because the people who had murdered my brother were still out there. As you all know, I work for Fox News Channel, and it's been a tremendous platform for me, and I thank the people over at Fox News Channel, Suzanne Scott, and many others, who've allowed me to be able to tell my story. And as I begin to tell the story, it really hit me that many people who don't have access to such platforms to be able to get justice for their families, to have their voices known. When my brother was murdered, the newscast that day said 18-year-old murdered, 2 other people shot. That was it. No name, no picture. And how many other people are experiencing that daily, if they even get mentioned on the news? I know that the people behind me are overwhelmed. I know that the Chicago police, there's many really good heroes within the Chicago police. I only share my story and I get before cameras because I want to ensure that not just my brother's murder case is solved, but many, many others. So I've been able to utilize the platform in which I have at Fox News to share other stories of families who are looking for that help. That's one of the reasons as I was going through the process of planning my brother's funeral and I saw how expensive it was. And I'm thinking, the folks who live in Chicago, a lot of poor people and live in these particular areas, they're receiving the brunt of the murders. How can they afford this? So it was a mission of mine and it's one that I'll continue.
Well, thank you so much for that. Mr. Garrido, or excuse me, Lieutenant Garrido, I have a friend who's a retired prosecutor, so I reached out to him in anticipation of today's meeting. I asked him what standards should apply to prosecutors, and he says as about national standards, there aren't many, but that's because each local community is supposed to elect folks who will protect them. And so rather than have a national standard, that's the approach he mentioned. That said, he goes on to say, the people of Chicago have no less interest in being safe from random shootings, gang violence, and rampant drug dealing than any other part of America. And then he says this, what is particularly risible about Kim Foxx is that she's looked primarily to the criminal defense attorneys and advocates for criminals known as the woke community, or known in the woke community as the criminal justice affected community, not victim groups, not police or law enforcement organizations. For example, Fox, as well as approximately 3 dozen Soros DAs out of the 2,500 elected DAs in the United States, do not participate in the National DA Association, by far the largest prosecutor organization, which has been around since 1950. and that organization, to which they don't apparently belong, has avoided taking partisan political positions. She and other Soros DAs have coalesced around a much smaller group called the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, which has few members nationwide, and unlike the NDAA, has taken very partisan political positions. My question to you is, after all that, is it true that they're taking political positions as opposed to those which are going to help more adequately control crime?
Absolutely.
Please explain them.
Absolutely. Just like I said before about her changing the threshold for felony theft from 500 to 1,000, she has a lot of leeway to decide what they're going to charge and what they're not going to charge. Or when we present homicide cases or any case for felony approval, they put a lot of restrictions and just create these long lists of things that we have to do to try to hoops that we have to jump through, and they make it difficult. If I could, a sentence from a letter that one of the state's attorneys, a top-ranking state's attorney, left. He said, the state's attorney voiced her concern with a headline and the heat she was getting over her backers and never voiced any concern over the fact that this woman was shot and killed simply for walking to the store, and nobody's going to face a murder charge. That is what is wrong with this administration. This administration is more concerned with political narratives and agendas than with victims and prosecuting violent crime. This is why I can't stay any longer. This is one of several public letters that were put out by state's attorneys as they're leaving. It's 100% based on political ideology and not seeking justice for victims in Chicago.
Thank you so much. My time's up. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Lieutenant Garrido, I'd like to start with you and return to the subject of bail reform and appropriate bail procedures. I had the privilege of serving my community as a federal prosecutor and later as a judge, so I understand what a critical part of the criminal process that is and how much it affects overall community safety. Will you elaborate for us, please, on the effect it is having on the law enforcement officers' ability to do their job when prosecutors don't seek detention hearings and judges are prohibited from considering community safety and likelihood of recidivism as factors in making appropriate bail determinations?
Well, it's just another nail in the coffin where we repeatedly see different things that embolden the bad guys and make these criminals feel that they're not going to be held accountable. So why should they care? They're not worried about getting arrested because they know they're going to be out right away. We oftentimes would joke, just because for years our criminal justice system in Chicago here and Cook County has been in such shambles that most of these offenders, they'll get off on technicalities or whatnot, but at least sometimes they would spend time in jail while waiting for their trial, so they would get at least some time served. Now that's out the window. So you've got the bad guys are just learning, and they're quickly learning because this stuff is broadcast everywhere, that they don't have to worry about any consequences. So it makes it extremely difficult for officers to do their job because you're now dealing with people that are even more combative than they normally would be.
You also touched on the subject of juvenile offenders. In your experience, tell me about some of the juvenile offenders you see. Is it important for prior juvenile offenses to be considered in the totality of the seriousness of a criminal's behavior and in future prosecution and sentencing or detention decisions?
Absolutely. We've seen time and again the gangbangers are actually using, they've done it for years. They always use the younger kids. They would use them to do their burglaries. They use them to hold their weapons. They use them to hold their drugs because they know that they're just going to get a slap on the wrist. So that's always been the case. But now it seems as though these young offenders are getting more dangerous, quite honestly. They're now shooting at people. They're now stealing cars and doing carjackings. Like I said, just the other day, the offenders were 4 of them, and they were ages 12 to 16. So we've got our juvenile criminal offenders, at least here in Chicago, are becoming more and more violent. So absolutely, that stuff should be considered.
Officer Yanez, you touched on the dismantling of the gang and gun specialized units. Would you elaborate for us, please, on why those units were established, why they're important, and why it is affecting the efficacy of your work not to have them anymore?
So I worked 7 District TAC for 4+ years, 4.5 years. And as John Garrido said, you have to learn your technique. Everyone learns their profession in a certain field, and you have officers that had experienced numerous years over the years of working with certain individuals, whether it be gang members, gun offenders, narcotics, and just being able to deal with it when it comes to saturation. But the units that were established were for basically common sense what they were named. The gangs were for officers that had prior knowledge with certain gang members or leaders, and they knew when a gang shooting happened and occurred where the retaliation would be, so we can focus on that area. As far as the gun teams, you know, they specialized in retrieving guns from offenders, gun offenders. Saturation was basically you saturated an area where there was going to be, where we had knowledge of like gang shooting, you know, we would saturate that area so there wasn't a retaliation. But when you dismantle that and you take away some of the perks, so they work 10-hour days as one of the perks, you have officers that have to be on the job and you're arresting individuals, and then you have officers that are, you know, that takes a process. You know, you're arresting them, so it could take up to several hours to process on a criminal offender being charged with a weapon. So you also increase the overtime pay, you know, so it's just, yeah.
And Lieutenant Garrido, I'd like to also touch on the subject of officer discipline and the concept that officers are confronted with anonymous complaints against them and denied an opportunity to understand the allegations or confront the witnesses that might be making allegations against them. Would you share with us what is going on in that regard and how it is affecting officer morale?
Yeah. It's a huge impact on morale. Just to give an example, we have officers that will, the complaint will come in, it's an anonymous complaint, the investigation will go on, and these investigations sometimes take 2, 3, 4 years. It's incredible. I had one investigation for us that was 9 years in the making. So these officers are going to work every day. They don't know when the next shoe is going to drop. They don't know where this investigation is going to go. They don't know if they're going to somehow be criminally prosecuted as well. It's demoralizing for the officers, and if you can imagine that officer that's sitting there on roll call every day, it's impacting his partners and other officers because they also know that he's going through it, and some of them are going through it as well. His investigations just go on and on and on because I don't know what the reason is. They're short-staffed, they're not conducting the proper investigations, whatever it is. And then allowing these anonymous complaints, people learn quick. Just complain against the police. You just put in a complaint. They lie a lot. I mean, there are a ton of these investigations are false allegations, and at least when you had to make them sign an affidavit, at least that helped reduce it a little bit. But by eliminating that, now anybody and everybody is making complaints against the officers.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Lieutenant, Mr. Caldwell mentioned earlier a no chase policy. Is that the policy with the police department now?
So we've always had a vehicle chase policy, and it's a balancing test. Yeah. And you have to weigh things out, safety of the public. And
but a foot chase as well?
They've added a lot. Well, they've added a lot of restrictions and things that make it difficult to actually conduct a chase. Well, now they just recently added, the end of last year, a foot chase policy, which also includes a balancing test. So if you walk up to a corner, you get a call of somebody selling drugs on the corner, and they match the description that was given, and they take off running, that alone is not enough. You are not supposed to chase those offenders or those subjects. And the interesting thing about it, as far as how things are so politicized, criminals are generally stupid. So it took them years to figure out that our vehicle chase policy is restrictive. Well, Lightfoot and Brown couldn't wait to get out there and broadcast that we have a foot chase policy. So what happens, we end up with videos of people yelling at the officers that are conducting foot chases, yelling at them that they can't chase.
Wow. Can't chase him. And then if you do catch the bad guy, you get an anonymous complaint and you get a prosecutor who won't prosecute him. I mean, such a deal. And you wonder, again, I think one of the key elements here is the damage to morale. The fact that you were that many officers, 1,700 officers short, I think is scary. It's not my time. It's the gentleman from Virginia. He will get his full 5 minutes, of course. And the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. this is a truly enlightening opportunity for us to hear from you, for the public to hear from you as well. Your voices need to be heard, and as Lieutenant Garrido said, the silent majority needs to speak up. I come from a state where we have these problems. We've had these problems of recidivism, but in the 90s we took action to address them. We passed a ban on parole. We passed stricter laws regarding bond and bail laws, and we now have the lowest recidivism rate in the country in Virginia. We're blessed to have leaders who recognize the benefit of that, and we want to keep it that way. Illinois is unfortunately in a different place. Their recidivism rate, whereas Virginia's is around 20%, Illinois is around 35%, Chicago's 89%, as high as 89% potentially. It is really shocking to hear what has happened to the recidivism rate and what that does to crime. Lieutenant, can you talk about the recidivism rate, but also in the idea that not just chasing, but taking action regarding smaller crimes can help prevent larger crimes?
With the recidivism, and I don't know the statistics, but I know there's numbers out there that show that, you know, a majority of the crimes are committed by the same people that are just out over and over and over and over. As far as the other aspect of your question, I'm sorry, can you repeat that last part again?
Well, can you talk about kind of a broken windows policy and,
right.
where?
So up until 2016, we used to have a policy of doing contact cards, and that's where officers would, anytime they stopped or came in contact with somebody, you would document it on a little card and you would turn it in, and they would get put in the computer. So it helped actually solve a lot of investigations because people could look up and see where people were that matched certain descriptions. Policies changed. We went to an investigative stop report, which was 2 pages, took a ton of time to complete, and the numbers dropped big time. So before 2016, we were stopping anywhere from 450 to 500,000 people a year here in Chicago. So it's engaging with the public out there. It's proactive policing. That first year, 2016, we dropped to 108,000 stops, and it's dropped down to now where it's probably in about the 30,000 stops a year. That's a lot of people that are not interacting with the police anymore, so they feel emboldened, they're braver, they're going to carry their weapons, they're going to do more crimes.
And talk to me about the impact that the Defund the Police movement has had on that as well.
These officers want to do the job that they are hired to do. They want to go out there, they want to work. Helping people is in their DNA. And putting these restrictions on and making it extremely difficult, making them jump through hoops, making them spend all this downtime. You know, before it was quick. You know, you'd stop somebody, you could do a contact card, you'd move on to the next one. When you have to stop and do a 2-page report in the computer, it completely hampers the whole process.
And Officer Yanez, you mentioned your coworker who actually hesitated, and the impact of that Defund the Police movement on officers hesitating on the scene, whether it is to engage or to actually take action. Can you speak a little bit about the impact that the Defund the Police movement has had on officer responsiveness?
I didn't say that. My partner never hesitated, but I can see that.
One of your coworkers, and maybe it was Lieutenant.
Yeah, the lieutenant had mentioned that the officer was fighting with the gentleman with PCP, but I have seen a lot of it while I was an officer, that you second guess yourself, like even pulling your gun out during a situation where you kind of have a gut feeling. There's like, you got to get a number for that. And then so many different policies. You know, it's so hard to be a proactive officer nowadays because of all the limitations that you have as an officer, as a liability.
Well, it's led to 2,000 officers short this year, 350 resignations, lateral transfers, as you were talking about. And the Safety Act just seems to be really, really harmful, and the potential is going to be very dangerous. I'm looking at, for a bond hearing, you need to establish proof to hold a defendant. You have to establish proof that the suspect committed the crime and poses a threat to the physical safety of a specific identifiable person. Wouldn't that necessitate the introduction of trial evidence in a bond hearing? And how on earth would you be able to adjudicate in a bond hearing whether a proof existed that a suspect committed a crime?
Well, here, just I think it was this morning, yesterday morning or this morning, an offender shot his neighbor's dog in the head. Officers responded. He was a foot chase. They recovered a backpack that he pitched that had weapons in it and loaded magazines. And for court today, they actually did ask for a pretrial detention, and the judge said no and denied it. So even if we have prosecutors that are willing to actually go forward with detention, now we have judges that will throw that one out.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
What's happening in Chicago is a travesty, and unfortunately there are some in the world of politics who would prefer not to talk about what's happening in Chicago, who would have us become almost habituated to the horrifying scale of violence and death going on here. And so I think this is a really important hearing that we're having today to send a loud and clear message that what's happening here should never happen in the United States of America. For that matter, what's happening in Manhattan should never happen in the United States of America. What's happening in LA should never happen in the United States. What's happening in San Francisco should never happen in the United States. San Francisco is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and it's now losing people faster than any major city in U.S. history, largely because of the crime situation there. So there is no doubt that we need to restore proper penalties for criminal conduct, as well as, by the way, restore evidence-based rehabilitation to help offenders turn their lives around. But what is just as important, I believe, is we as a country need to restore the proper respect and admiration for our men and women in law enforcement. Because if you talk to any police chief or sheriff and any community around the country, they will tell you that they are understaffed, that they are having trouble retaining people, they're having trouble recruiting people. Here in Chicago, for example, since 2019, the Chicago force has lost 3,300 officers. They've only replaced about half of them. Lieutenant Garrido, you testified that the force is about 2,000 officers short. Resignations increased by 65% from 2000 to 2021. One former state prosecutor said that morale among law enforcement in Illinois is at an all-time low. But it's not just happening here. A survey from 2023 by the Police Executive Research Forum showed that agencies are losing officers faster than they can hire new ones. And there were nearly 50% more resignations in 2022 than in 2019, such that the total sworn staff has dropped nearly 5% over the last 3 years. In my state of California, the total patrol officers dropped by over 13% over a little more than a decade. That means it dropped from 195 officers per 100,000 residents to just 169, and this level is now the lowest level since at least 1991, which of course means when you have fewer officers patrolling the streets that criminals are able to operate with greater impunity. So, Lieutenant Garrido, there are obviously a lot of causes of this problem. In particular, the taking tools away from law enforcement officers to do their jobs and the actual defunding of the police. But to what extent is this attributable as well to sort of a hangover of the defund the police movement and the toxic, malicious rhetoric that was directed at law enforcement by certain people in public life?
Oh, this is mission accomplished for the defund the police movement. When I took the exam in 1989 to come on the job, 35,000 people took the test with me. Now they're lucky if they can get 1,500 people to take the test. They're actually, you can walk in the day of and actually take the exam if you just happen to be strolling by and see that there's a test being given. It's extremely difficult to recruit right now. And that's all by and large because of the way that our elected officials, and some would say maybe they don't realize it, but I think they do. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're saying. And they're demonizing our officers. And they're making this job not desirable. So nobody wants to come on it. And another significant impact, my father was a Chicago police officer. My uncle was a Chicago police officer. At one time, I know Carlos's father was a Chicago police officer. At one time, parents, they would want their kids to follow in their footsteps. Now there's a huge movement. I don't know anybody that would tell their children to come on the job now.
Yeah,
and that's a big portion. I mean, children of police officers is a large portion of our force, and they're just not doing it anymore.
That's a really important point. And so this message that, our police officers, our men and women in law enforcement are the guardians of our community. While the rest of us run away from danger, they run to danger. Their work is the cornerstone of a civil society, protecting the rule of law. And yet you had all of this rhetoric vilifying police officers that sent precisely the opposite message. So in addition to changing our laws, I think we really need to rededicate ourselves as a country to honoring and celebrating those folks who are in law enforcement, and to have almost a new national campaign dedicated to celebrating law enforcement as an honorable calling, a noble calling, in order to inspire a new generation of young people, including those who are sons and daughters of folks who are in law enforcement now, to want to serve, to see the problems that we're facing in many of our cities and say that in spite of the risks, they want to be part of the solution because it's a function that is so closely tied to the public good. So I think that all of us have a role to play in that. One thing I did is for Police Week, I honored an officer with in different departments within my district, as what we called the Police Honor Roll, and gave them a congressional recognition on the floor of the House of Representatives. For citizens, just thanking officers when you come across them in daily life, I think can go a long way as well. And sort of in that vein, in closing, I'd just like to thank everyone here today, including our two witnesses, of course, for your service to your community and to our country. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. That's a great point about the family and the tradition, the legacy that's there, and how that's changing. Unfortunately, we have three more members. We have Mr. Fitzgerald, Mr. Gates via Zoom, and then we'll finish with the gentlelady from this great state, Ms. Miller. So Mr. Fitzgerald is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks everybody for being here this morning. Thank the Fraternal Order Police for hosting us. I too believe this is an important hearing. I know there's some criticism out there coming from, the data and the statistics may be blown out of proportion. My congressional seat is the suburbs of Milwaukee, and we've been kind of seeing a similar trend that's been going on for some time. First thing I wanted to just touch on, my father was a Chicago police officer. 1966, he was sworn in. And so I grew up, and our family grew up in the 15th District. He was there almost the entire time he was with the Chicago Police Department. One of the things that, so this would have been in the 70s, right? And one of the things that you saw, I think, back then that may be missing, and that's why I want to ask the question of you today. There used to be a sense of community policing. In other words, if you were certainly a beat cop in Chicago, you knew just about everybody that lived certainly on your block. You knew anybody that was in that district, or you had a contact with them. So there was much more of kind of a give and take when it came to everyday policing. I'm just wondering, have you seen that diminish over the years? And how much of that do you think is a problem? So, Lieutenant Guerrero, could you respond to that first?
There's no doubt people are becoming more and more isolated and less community-oriented. They tried to start doing block clubs and different things like that to get people involved to engage in their neighborhoods. But I think also if you were to go out and start knocking on doors in some of the most violent neighborhoods in the city, the residents there would tell you they want the police in their community. They want officers there. They want those gangbangers off the corner. They absolutely crave it. That what we're hearing, the narrative that we're hearing, is put out by the politicians. It's not the actual people that are on the ground in these neighborhoods. They actually want us there, and they want to work with us, and they want to make their communities safer. They don't want to have to worry about taking a bullet every time they go out for the groceries.
Right. Officer Yanez, can you respond to that? What is the feel kind of out there on the street?
I feel that, you know, the community is scared. You know, if they're seen talking to the police officers, nothing's being done to these offenders or criminals. So they're afraid of retaliation, so they kind of avoid officers and talking to them. I remember one incident where we cleaned a whole block. They were having an illegal block party, and it was like over 300 offenders in the street, and drinking alcohol, drugs. And once we cleared it out, you know, we kind of walked that whole block because offenders sometimes throw firearms under cars or in a bush. As we were walking, the neighbors started coming out, and it was at night time. You know, it was around 8:30 p.m. And they started coming out and sit on their porch. And I'm always the first officer that'll, you know, engage in a conversation with the community. And I spoke with an old elderly lady, and she was like, "Thank you for doing this." She was like, "I can't remember the last time I came out in the afternoon when it got dark and sat on my porch and felt safe." And we had supervisors had vehicles at each end of the block, and none of the individuals that were there on the block lived there. You know, we allowed everyone that lived on the block to stay, but none of them, I would say about 98%, didn't live there. You know, so
right.
It's really hard. You make it hard for witnesses in the community to step up. You know, it's just terrible.
Yeah, I think the other thing you hear oftentimes from officers is that if you apprehend somebody and within 24 hours, 48 hours, you see that that person's back on the street, that sends a message not only obviously to every officer that's on the street, but to other members of the community that, you know, everybody knows what's going on, right? They know if somebody's been arrested. They know if somebody's been part of an incident that went down in their own neighborhood, and then they're back out on the street. I mean, it just sends a wrong message, doesn't it?
Oh, it definitely does. And actually, I would actually elaborate on that. A lot of them, the community knows who does the shooting, you know, but they're so scared because now the judicial system, you're forced to be a witness, and you got to attend, and let's say the witnesses have jobs. The court system, the attorneys, the defense attorneys, they keep continuing. It's all continuance all the time. And the criminals, they don't care because they don't have a job. They're locked up. They're being held on bond. You know, so it's like they just keep continuing it till the witnesses get tired of the court system. You know, it's just terrible.
Thank you both for your service. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates. I think we got him remotely. Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I regret I'm not there with you in person, and I would be, but for some of the ongoing negotiations regarding our government funding that we're working through. I want to follow up on where my colleague, Representative Fitzgerald, was speaking with Officer Yanez about the development of witnesses. And I just wonder if what we've seen from prosecutors that don't charge cases appropriately or that plead cases out for minor offenses where people who might be violent are back on the streets, does that make it harder to get witnesses to come forward? Do the witnesses potentially fear that despite their participation in the criminal justice system, they might be subject to some sort of retaliation?
Oh, definitely, 100%. You know, especially with this cash bond, you're going to be releasing offenders, and the first thing their lawyer tells them is there's no victim, no witness, there's no crime. So all they're going to do is retaliate and threaten, and at worst, maybe kill some of these re-victims. They're going to basically re-victimize these victims and witnesses so that they don't have to have a trial or court.
It's just an astonishing amount of testimony that we have a criminal justice system that now the participants in that system are saying re-victimizes the people that we're trying to protect. I don't believe that the answer to these questions comes out of Washington, but I do think hearings like this are really important because, you know, we want to get a sense of what some of the early warning signs are in a community like Chicago so that the challenges you face don't metastasize. If you were giving a briefing to another community that had a prosecutor with some of the same theories that the prosecutors have had in Chicago, or some of the constraints that a city council might try to put on a police department, what would you do to warn other communities about some of the early things that they would want to rebuff so that their streets aren't turned over to the criminals like Chicago's have been?
It's very difficult because I would also fear for their safety, you know, so it's like I can only speak for myself. Like after the incident that happened to me, I had my family and me move out of the city because I just felt it unsafe. I love the city of Chicago, and it's a beautiful city. And I love the people, the community, but I just felt like I couldn't protect my family the way I used to. So if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'd love the lieutenant's perspective on that as well.
I mean, at the very basis of it is to pay attention to who they're voting for. It's not just with just one person. It's not just the mayor. It's not just our prosecutor. It's the mayor, the prosecutors, our judges, our legislators, even our aldermen. It's become such a cesspool of ill intent. It makes no sense when people are repeatedly voting against their interests and putting people in place that are having such a negative impact on our communities, and it just almost appears as though that everybody's somewhat blind to it.
Yeah, I mean, getting it wrong is different than ill intent. Ill intent makes it seem like the whole construct of these policies is to end policing, whether it's to take away immunities, to take away policing tools. When you don't allow chase of the bad guys, in Florida, we would think that's like not having police at all, because you don't have the ability to bring anyone to justice that may have committed a criminal offense. You know, Mr. Caldwell, you've heard the gentleman sitting next to you, Mr. Yanis, say he's left. Your brother tragically was the victim of a murder, died. I guess my question to you is Chicago savable? Or is the city in such a downward trajectory that our only hope is to make sure that these policies don't spread to other places?
That's something that I've thought about a great deal since last year. Is Chicago savable? Absolutely, it is savable. I think we absolutely have to unite as a city. And a lot of the leadership that we've seen, Brandon Johnson, as you know, he just got elected into office, but crime is now up 29-30%. If the leadership doesn't start changing, if the folks in Chicago don't start voting differently and demanding justice versus becoming numb to what we see as a daily slaughter, then we can't get anything done. We can't have movement. But I do believe that the city can be saved and is worth being saved.
Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller.
Thank you. Last week, Governor Pritzker's Safety Act went into effect here in Illinois, making Illinois the first state to do away with cash bail. And I want to remind everybody that 100 out of 102 states' attorneys oppose this. Despite Governor Pritzker and the Democrats' assurances that the Safety Act would not result in the release of violent offenders, initial reports tell us a different story. The first individual released under this new policy had been arrested for pepper spraying 4 police officers. Further reports shed light on a similar case where a man on parole for armed robbery and aggravated battery was once again apprehended, this time for the theft of merchandise valued at $68,000 from a store in DuPage County. Astonishingly, he walked free after the arrest. The release of such an individual who clearly poses a significant threat to the community without requiring bail, it clearly shows Governor Pritzker lied to the people of Illinois. And I want to make the statement that the first role of the government is to protect the people. There is a party that is supporting an open border and defunding the police. And I always told my kids, there's a scripture that says a tree is known by its fruit. Likewise, a politician is known by their votes and the policies they promote. The fact is, every Democrat voted for the Safety Act and supported Governor Pritzker's lie to the American people, and every Republican voted no. And I am so sad for you all that have been impacted, our police who are being defunded and demoralized. The American people do not support that, and there are more of us than them. We are the normals, and they are the crazies. What I want to know is, what is it going to take to wake the people up in Chicago, and especially in the communities that are disproportionately impacted by this violence, to realize that the people they are electing are promoting these policies and voting for it? It's a clear line. 100% of the Democrats voted for Pritzker's Safety Act. So, Lieutenant, I'd like to start with you and let you each share what can be done to wake the people up.
All right. So, several of my friends asked me why I was going to come here to testify today, kind of citing the definition of insanity as doing the same thing over and over and expecting something different. But it doesn't mean that we don't do anything. We can't not speak up. We can't not shine a light on it. We can't, we have to draw attention to what's happening and what's going on. What it's going to take to wake them up, I don't know. I mean, think about just the few that you listed, cases of these offenders that are walking free, or the guy who, shot and killed his neighbor's dog this morning. These are clearly violent people, and that's not even enough to get them held.
If they can't see, they could at least hear what's going on in the city. I believe that the bill has a beautiful name, but it doesn't state that. It's nothing safe about that. All you're going to end up doing is re-victimizing the victim, and worse, even if they're not violent criminals for what they did, they're going to get out and they're going to be afraid to go back to jail. And all they're going to do is hurt a witness or a victim or a law-abiding citizen. So it just doesn't make any sense.
During the most recent mayoral election, public safety was the #1 concern for Chicagoans. The first time in 20 years. It wasn't the economy, it wasn't infrastructure. It's what people have been seeing on their televisions and experiencing personally. Today, I have a friend who's with me from my 8th grade class who experienced the tragedy of 2 of her innocent brothers being murdered. So many families within the city of Chicago have experienced the same. What's going to change the trajectory? And we're going to see we're seeing the implementation of the Safety Act now. As people see more and more of these things get out of control, someone's going to get fed up. I know that we've become numb to it here in Chicago. The value of human life has been eroded, but things will change as more and more people, whether they be on the north side, the Gold Coast, the places where you don't usually see crime historically, the more they get fed up. And especially with Brandon Johnson, who I don't think has been doing an effective job, even though he just started as mayor. He said we can't demonize kids. The ideology of a child is innocence. An innocent child does not go and rob somebody. An innocent child at 11 years old isn't carjacking people. They're not murdering and shooting people. We have to hold these people accountable no matter what age they are, and we have to throw the book at them. And honestly, this is just where we are right now in the city of Chicago. No more leniency on murder and shootings. Hold these folks accountable and hold them accountable today.
And I'd like to finish up by saying we need to hold Governor Pritzker accountable and every Democrat that voted for the Safety Act. Thank you.
Well said. Well said, Mary. Officer Giannis, how old were you when you became a Chicago police officer?
It was 2014, 32, I think.
32? Yeah. And Lieutenant Garrity, how old were you?
I was 23.
23.
I was 23.
So if you talk to a 32-year-old or a 23-year-old, I think you said today, would you encourage them to be a police officer?
Yes, but not in Chicago.
Wow. I would, but it's just like I tell everybody, you got to have a passion for it, but it's a difficult job right now.
Yeah.
It's a difficult position that you're going to be put in. Just learn the ropes, things will change.
Yeah, but I think both of you testified earlier that so many officers are telling their sons and daughters, don't do it.
Yeah, they're telling they're telling their kids not to join the Chicago Police Department.
Yeah.
I mean, there's parents there, you know.
And many of our families like yours, that where your dads were officers, you
generational,
became an
right?
officer.
It's something that we do and something that we love to do, and so it's heartbreaking to not want to guide their children to the job that they were so proud of doing themselves. So many times they're just directing them to go elsewhere.
And that's not just Chicago. That's happening in other big cities around the country as well. Yeah, that's to me one of the scarier things about all the defund police and everything else they're doing, making your job tough. You can't. I mean, the idea that you can't chase down a bad guy. To me, that was like, you got to be kidding. I'm just a country boy from Ohio, but that seemed like you got to be kidding me. That's what I thought police do. You know, like makes absolutely no sense. So we want to thank you all for being here. I thought maybe we would end with Mr. Caldwell. If you could just remind us again about your brother. You know, I think you said he was 18.
He just turned 18.
Just to turn 18. What was he thinking about doing? Or maybe even your brother and your friend's two brothers. Because in the end, we got to focus on how all this stuff is truly impacting families.
Yes.
People.
Yes.
Human beings, fellow human beings in this community. That is what this, in the end, that's what it's all about. And so tell us, the last 2 minutes and 52 seconds, tell us about Christian or your friend's two brothers who were tragically killed as well.
Christian was excited about college. That was his goal. As I mentioned previously, at 16, he wanted me to take him on a college tour outside of Chicago, which I did. There's so many like Christian in this town, so many good, innocent kids who just want to be afforded a life to live. And oftentimes within the city of Chicago, whether it be due policies, because soft on crime policies come with a mentality where criminals just simply take over and they have no fear or regard for the repercussions of breaking the law. We have to change that immediately. And the way that we change that, and the way that we prevent another Christian or my friend's two brothers prevent their deaths, is to be tough on crime. Law and order is the only way we're going to change the situation here in the city of Chicago. And I am hopeful that this committee hearing will lead to some more light on that. But I am also disappointed that many of your colleagues on the Democrat side chose not to come here. Many of the folks who've said Black Lives Matter, and they do, but they're not showing that Black Lives Matter by not being here today. Thank you, Chairman Jordan.
Again, I want to thank you all. This has been very insightful for the members of the House Judiciary Committee, and we appreciate the time that you've took to come and share your story and provide answers to our questions. And more importantly, we appreciate the service you've provided this community as people who put on the uniform and risk your lives. And with that, the committee, we will do a quick press conference, press availability just outside in the tent. Again, we want to thank the FOP. You guys have been tremendous hosts, and we appreciate what you do. And thank you for the hospitality you've shown the committee. With that, we are adjourned.